Hello, here is a video called DOM Overview, D-O-M Overview. Well, what is DOM? DOM stands for Document Object Model, and what it is, put simply, is it's the representation of the current web page inside your current JavaScript program running on that page. So ultimately, it's what allows us to use JavaScript to check things that are on the web page, to change things that are on the web page, to add and remove things on the web page. Essentially, all of our superpowers to use JavaScript to manipulate web pages that our program is running on. And all of this amazing power lives inside a single variable in our program called document, which is the thing that we're going to be investigating right now. So in this video, what we're going to do really is just look at the fundamental things that we can do with the document object model, with the DOM, so that we're in a place where we know the absolute basics of how to use JavaScript to affect a web page that JavaScript is running on. So the best way to do this is to do it. So let us begin with this beautiful DOM overview. The first thing that we're going to need, if we're going to do anything at all, is, you guessed it, a web page. We are going to need a web page in order to work out how this DOM thing works. So I'm heading over to my Cart263 repository, going into topics, and then this web page topic of ours, and I'm going to start a new web project. I'm going to make a folder, and that folder is going to be called DOM Overview. And I'm going to open this up in Atom, this empty folder. I'll add all of my files inside Atom over here. So we've got nothing. What's the first thing we need when we have a web page? We need an HTML file, at least one. That's what the browser is going to use to actually render a page. So I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it index.html, the classic name. Now, what am I going to put in here? I've got some stuff in the notes for this discussion, so I'm just going to copy and paste across in this instance. So paste. So here's a web page. There's nothing super impressive going on in this particular web page. It's just some basic HTML code, right, to represent a simple little web page. One thing about it, though, is it does have an image in it, and we can see that it's saying that there's an image in assets, images, clown.png, but very clearly I don't have that image in this project, so I'm going to need to add that if I want my project to work. Just by way of example, though, actually, if we run this page, and to do so we will have to drag it from another monitor, because I'm so clever. You can see we've got a broken image here, right? And one good thing, as you can see actually, about the alt attribute. See here, we've got an alt attribute as part of that image element. One good thing is that if your source doesn't work and the image can't be loaded for some reason, you get a little broken image icon, and you also get the alt text, so you know, even if it's not working, what you should expect to be seeing there. Okay. So it didn't work, and the reason it didn't work is the reason that we know. There's no file at that location. So let's add a new folder, and we'll call it assets. And let's add another new folder inside there. We'll call that images. And inside assets images, we're going to put a clown PNG. Now, fortunately for me, I know that I have clown PNGs literally littered all over my computer, so I'm just going to copy the one from the HTML lecture that I gave in this series, and I'm going to paste that into my clown, as clown PNG and assets images. So now, because the image element's source attribute is working, we see our beautiful smiling and hopeful clown. Perfect. So we've got some working HTML. You can see it's just like we've got a heading, we've got a section, we've got another section. The sections have IDs. We've got a span called pronoun in here. We've got all kinds of bits and pieces just so that we can demonstrate different ways of working with HTML from inside JavaScript. For completeness sake, I'll also just add a CSS folder and file. So I'm going to create another folder in here called CSS. And inside there, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call that style.css, which is the classic name, right? And here, I don't actually have any desire to do any real styling, but I'll just add a body tag and I'll set the font of the web page to sans serif, just so that I'm doing something, you know, just to feel effective. So now our web page is in a sans serif font. This font is Helvetica by default on a Mac. So good. So we've got all of the little bits and pieces that we might have for a web page. And now what we want to do, of course, is we want to write some code that's going to run on this web page, that's going to do things with the HTML and the CSS. That's what we're interested in. So we want to add a script, and you probably already know how to add a script to a web page. We use the script tag, right? We use the script tag and it points towards our script. So let's make our script first. So again, we're going to need a new folder in the main project. I'm going to call this folder JS for JavaScript. And I'm going to want to put a new file in there, which I'm going to call script.js. Again, very, very typical. There's my script. There's nothing in here because I haven't written a program yet. As we know, though, for that script to work, we have to insert it in here. And you might be familiar with the idea of putting it inside the head element of your web page. And that's fine. That's a reasonable thing to do. You would add your script tag. You would say script. The source of the script is js/script.js. And then we would close the script tag like that. So a standard script tag just has a source attribute that tells you where the script is. So this links my script to this web page, but because we're now working with the document object model, with the DOM, one really important thing is we only want our script to load and start running when all of the things inside our document, inside the body of our HTML, have loaded, right? And if we put the script tag up here before all of that stuff, we're going to run the risk that the document isn't ready when our script runs. This is obviously more likely to be a problem with large pages that take a decent amount of time to load, but it's something we definitely need to think about. So we only want our script to run when all of this stuff has already been loaded by the browser. And there's one really great way to guarantee that. There are a few ways that you can do it. One good way to guarantee it, and the most common way that you'll see, the best practice, is instead of putting our script tag up in the head element, I'm just going to cut it, which is Command X or Control X. You actually just put it at the very bottom of the body. So what this is saying now, because web pages get loaded linearly, is it's going to go through the body, it's going to load all of the content of the body into the actual displayed page, and then at the very end it's going to load our script, and that's going to cause our script to run. So by putting the script at the bottom of the body tag, we guarantee that the web page is ready for our script to do something with. Okay, so now we're ready to do some programming with the document object model. As I said, the document object model is kind of accessed through the single variable called document. So let's do the most obvious thing, perhaps, the thing that all curious people should probably do, which is that we could just do a console.log of what's inside the document variable. So this document variable is provided automatically for us in JavaScript because our JavaScript is running in a browser. So the browser makes this available, and what this is, as we've said, is it's a representation of the current web page, except it's inside our JavaScript, right? So if we go and have a look at this running on the web page by bringing up our JavaScript developer stuff, you can see it's showing up here, right? And in fact, when I mouse over it, you can see the entire page highlighted, right? That's a pretty neat little feature. So it just says document, but it's got the little right pointing arrow next to it, which means I can toggle that to unfold it. And what you can see is inside this document variable, or at least the way that it's represented in Chrome, is just a little representation of the web page. So there's the head part of the web page and there's the body part of the web page. So I could unpack the body, and then you can see all of the little bits that my web page is composed of. There's the h1 tag, there's one section, there's the other section, there's my script at the bottom. I could unpack the clown section. There's the h2 at the top. There's the image of my clown, etc. So what's inside the document when we view it in a console.log in Chrome is the web page. That's literally what's inside the document. It's the model of the web page. if you look at this in other browsers, for example, if you look at this in Firefox, you'll actually see something a bit different. It'll show you a different representation of what's inside that variable. The key thing to know, though, is that that variable has got our document in it. That's what we're going to be able to use to manipulate the web page. So let me close that down. The other thing that you're probably noticing, if you're more familiar with using a library like p5.js, for example, is that this console.log is not inside a function, right? I just said console.log document, just that's all that my script has. There's no functions that are being run to do that, and that's fine. Like, this is a completely normal way of programming when we're dealing with this DOM style plain JavaScript. And the reason that it's working right is, again, the script is at the very bottom, so it only runs, and it runs whatever is inside the script once everything else has been loaded. So as soon as the script tag, as soon as the browser loads the script tag, it will run anything that is just written out as an instruction in here. So console.log document is the one instruction. If this feels weird and you would like to have a setup function, that's the thing that runs at the beginning of your program, you can still do that, right? So we could put this console.log inside a setup, and we could call the setup function at the top of our script. So now this is the same program. It's still going to run as soon as the page loads, but now it has a sort of a more familiar feel, right? It's completely up to you whether that makes you feel more comfortable about your web page or whether you don't really care, okay? So here we know that all of the things in setup are going to run once right at the beginning of our program because it gets called once right at the beginning of our program up here, okay? I'm going to follow the more standard convention, which is not to do this. So I'm just going to have the things that I want to do in my document, in my script for this web page, just written out here. So let me delete that and let's really start to do something. So what is it that we want to do in order to manipulate a web page? Well, the things that we tend to want to do is we want to access things, elements on the web page, and then affect them somehow, right? So the most simple thing that we might want to do is get access to some element on the web page and change it somehow. So let's look at an example of that. And the way that we're going to do that is we need methods that allow us to get pieces of the web page, elements on the web page, and manipulate them inside JavaScript. And the most important of those is this one called document.getElementById. Now, important is actually the wrong word. This is just a very, very common way of accessing something in your web page. So as you might imagine, getElementById is going to allow us to access something on the web page that has an ID attribute associated with it. So let's go and have a quick look at what we might access. So you can see that this main heading here, this h1 tag or element has an ID of main heading. This span has an ID of pronoun. This section has an ID of clown section. There's lots of options. Let's access the main heading. So how do we do that? To get hold of the main heading, we say document.getElementById, and then inside the parentheses we say which ID, and that's a string. So main heading is the one, main heading is the one that I want to access, right? That's how I get the main heading. But if I'm getting the main heading, where is it going? Where is it going to go? Right now it's going to go nowhere. What document.getElementById does is it returns the element. So I need a variable to store it in. So I'm going to create a variable called main heading, and I'm going to assign the result of document.getElementById main heading into there. So when this line of code runs, JavaScript is going to go get access to the web page, which we know is inside the document variable. It's going to look for an element with the ID main heading. It's going to find it. It's going to return it, and that element, or rather our JavaScript representation of that element, is going to be in my main heading variable. So now, if I want to do stuff to that main heading element, I can do stuff to the thing inside this variable. And just by way of example, so that we can actually see something happen, we could, for example, change its color. So we could say main heading dot style, which is a property of HTML elements, dot color, which is a CSS property, is assigned, and then what color do I want to make it go? I'm going to use a hexadecimal string, and I'm going to say make it 339966. Not 100% sure what color that is. So I got an element by using getElementById, I stored it in a variable, and now I'm going to manipulate its style in this particular case. And this basic idea, which you can see is kind of a lot like using CSS, right? Like we've got a selector that allows us to select some element on the page, and then we've got manipulations on it. And in this case, I'm literally changing its CSS. So what happens on the main page when this code runs? Well, there you go, right? You can see that this h1 tag, which has the main heading ID, I accessed it, it was stored in my program, and then I changed its color using JavaScript, and hey presto, its color changed on the web page dynamically. So this loads, and my JavaScript runs and changes the color of the heading. To some extent, that is a huge amount of what we do when we are using JavaScript and the DOM. We get hold of elements and we make changes to them in various ways. So the biggest thing, of course, that we've just seen that we can do, one of the really important things that we might want to do dynamically, is we might want to change the CSS, right? So that's what we've done here, but let's just talk about it in a little bit more detail. So because CSS is what lets us change the visual representation of a web page, how the page looks and how the page is laid out, if we can dynamically change those things using JavaScript, potentially with user interaction or some kind of generation, clearly we can do a lot of interesting work just by changing a page's CSS from within JavaScript. And how do we do that? Well, we do it via the style property, right? So every single element that we can access with getElementById or other methods that we'll see soon, we can say .style, and that will let us access its CSS properties. As you saw, we access the color property of its style and we set it to a specific color. We can do that with other properties as well. So I could say main heading .style, and say I want to set its font size. Now, the way that font size is written in CSS, it's got a hyphen. But that's not going to work in JavaScript because JavaScript thinks that it's a minus sign. So if we are accessing these things in JavaScript this way, instead of using the hyphenated form that we're used to in CSS, font-size, we actually use camel case. So instead of font-size, we write font size with a capitalized S there. And again, we can set it to a string with the thing that we want. So let's set the heading size to 4 REM units, for example. So let's see what happens over here. It's bigger because we set it to 4 REM. And you can do this with any CSS property. Main heading.style.font family. Again, no dash, we use camel case. I could set that to courier, and if not courier, then monospace. What does that look like? Now it's in courier. Web page is steadily getting uglier, but that's just how I roll with CSS. And again, on and on we go, right? Main heading.style.background color is assigned red. Now oh, good grief, that is an eyesore. Oh boy, I'm so sorry. Now the background color of this element that we used getElementById to get hold of, we're changing its background color. So now it looks gross, but it looks gross because we changed it in JavaScript. So we can access with getElementById, and we can change style by using the style property, and then we can just name which property we want to change and change it with simple assignment from within JavaScript. So that's pretty powerful. One thing that's worth knowing is that if you prefer to write CSS properties the way that they're written in CSS, for example, font size with a hyphen, there is another way to write out accessing the properties of an object. So we know that, for example, that style is an object that has a color property because we write style.color. Another way to write that in JavaScript is to use bracket notation. So instead of this, I could write style and then square brackets and then the name of the property in the string. So I want to access the color property. This is the same kind of idea, but the good thing about this is then I don't need to use camel case. So for font size, I can then write a string that says font hyphen size to access the font size. Same thing for font family, font hyphen family, and same thing for background color. In square brackets, font, oh goodness, font hyphen color. No, just font background color. That's what it was. Look at me, look at me being clever. So this enables us to do the same thing, right? It's still being applied in the same way. but it lets us write out the regular CSS property names. I think that there's an advantage to that. It makes us, it's one less step of confusion between JavaScript and CSS. Depends a little bit on whether you feel like this syntax with the square brackets and the string inside is weird. But if you find that that's palatable, then I think that there's an advantage to writing CSS property names the way that they're really written. I find that I prefer it. Okay, so that's it. That's literally it. So now we literally have the power to change the CSS of any element on our page, right? Let's just return to something a little bit simpler here. So just setting the color. We can access any of the things with an ID. So for instance, if I wanted to get the well section, which is called well-section, same thing. Document.getElementById well section. I'll rename my variable to be a good person. The same thing happens, right? We're going to set the color of everything inside the well section to be this green, and therefore we see it reflected right here. Now the link doesn't change color in the same way because links have their own color rules which override the hierarchy because they're more specific. So wonderful. So there's just another couple of things to say about this. One thing to say is that this way of setting the CSS on an element has priority over other methods. So in particular, what this is really doing is it's setting the style attribute on the element. So writing this is the same thing as adding a style attribute to this section and setting its color there. And that has precedence over the other forms. So you can also set CSS in a style tag in the head, and you can also set CSS, as we have been, in a file. But doing it as an attribute has the highest priority. And that's what we're doing when we do it in JavaScript. So generally speaking, when we set CSS in JavaScript, it's going to override any other styling for that property. So we can be kind of confident that it's going to take effect, which I think is fairly useful, right? The other big thing, and this is a big thing, is well, what do you want to do with this? This becomes the question of what CSS properties are there and what can you set them to, right? It's a big, big open world now where this is how you use JavaScript to access an element and change its CSS. What you do with that becomes the big question, right? That's the big question of what do you want to change? How do you want your web page to change based on your code and CSS? So changing CSS is a big thing that we can do with the DOM, but we can do other things. So let's go back to changing the heading. There we go. Okay. So what else can we do beyond changing the CSS, which is already insanely powerful? We can do more. One of the things that we can do is we can change the actual textual content of an element. So instead of changing the main heading style, let's access a different property of that element called inner text. So main heading.inner text is a property of the main heading of this element that contains or will contain the text that it has. So if I change it to, for example, I feel great with 3 exclamation marks, that is going to change the actual text of that element. So if I go back to my web page now, the heading now says I feel great. That's another superpower, right? We can change the actual text on the web page. And I'm realizing actually that the way that I thought that maybe this would be more interesting is that I pre-prepared a super relevant piece of the HTML here, which has got a span with the ID of pronoun, and it's got the pronoun we in there. So let's change that instead. So I'm going to make a variable called pronoun, and I'm going to access the element with the ID of pronoun, and I'm going to change the pronoun inner text to you instead of we. So what does that look like? Well, it's slightly less intense than changing the main heading, but you can see now, although the original document said, well, here we are using the DOM, now it says, well, here you are using the DOM. And you can imagine how that kind of thing can be useful for dynamically generating different kinds of web pages based on, for example, user input, right? This is allowing us to have a kind of a template specified in the HTML, and then we can substitute out specific bits of it to maybe personalize it to a user. Now, the inner text thing, this inner text property of an element works just in the same way as any property of any object, which means that we can check it as well. So if, for example, we didn't know what was in the pronoun, we could check what's inside it. So we could say something like, if the pronoun is equal to the word we, then only then would we change it. Pronoun is a .inner text. Oh, goodness me. Pronoun.inner text. If that is we, then pronoun.inner text is assigned you. So this is going to have the same effect, right, because it is we. But this is just to say that you can check, for example, what's inside pronoun.inner text to find out what the text is on the web page right now. And if it's, for example, if it's we, then you can also use pronoun.inner text to change that. So you can both use it to access and to change text inside an element. So again, it works because it was we, but if we said it was like C or something like that, then it's not going to change because it wasn't C, it was we, and so our if statement doesn't take effect. Okay. So this inner text thing here, this only deals with the idea of plain text inside elements. So the pronoun, for example, was in plain text. However, there is another option that we have, which is that we can work with the inner HTML property. So I could also, if I wanted to include some HTML in the thing that I'm expressing, I could say pronoun.inner HTML is assigned, and again, I can just assign a string, but in this string, I can use HTML. So for example, if I wanted it to be bold, wanted to say you, but in bold, I could include my strong tag there, right, around it. So I can literally write HTML here, and if we go and look at it now, the U is in bold because it hasn't just added the word U, it's added U inside a strong tag. That behaves differently from inner text, right? If I changed this to inner text, then it interprets the whole thing as just plain text, and so we get the actual visible HTML tag here, which is clearly not what we want in this instance. So if we're wanting to include HTML in the thing that we're setting some text to, one way of doing that is setting its inner HTML property and including HTML tags. And that way we can, again, we can sort of affect some of the structural properties of the document that way. Okay, so that is allowing us, I mean, it's simple, right? But it's allowing a huge amount of power. So we can change the CSS, and now we can also change the text content of elements by using inner text and inner HTML. Those are big, big things that we're then able to manipulate, right? So let's do something else. One of the other big things that we might want to do in terms of manipulating existing elements on a web page, if we look at what we've done, right, we've changed the things inside here, like the text, and we've changed the styling of these things. But the thing that we can also manipulate are these properties of elements, attributes of elements, right? Like this H1 has attributes ID and class, and this image, for example, has 3 attributes. It's got an ID, it's got a source attribute, and it's got an alt attribute. And again, we might want to manipulate those things because we want to dynamically change some aspect. For example, if we want to change an image, then we might change we would change its source attribute to some other image, and that would change the image on the web page. So let's look at that example. How do we change attributes? Mercifully, it's relatively straightforward again. So in our script, again, we need to get access to a specific element on the page. So if I want to change the image, there are different ways that I could do it, but again, we're going to use getElementById, and so we're going to get the thing with the ID of clown image. So if I say let, I'm just going to call it image, is document.getElementById clown image. That's the ID that it has. And then how do I change its source attribute? There is a method called setAttribute. So I say image, which is the element that I want to affect. That's the image with the clown. setAttribute, because I want to change one of its attributes. And then this is going to take 2 arguments. One of them is which attribute. So the name of the attribute that I want to change is source, src, in a string. And then what do I want to change it to in another string? So I could change it to sort of anything I want. I need the address of another image. There's a really good service called Lorem Flickr, and I'm going to use that. So http loremflickr.com / the dimensions of the image, which is going to be 320 by 240, and then the category of image, or the sort of keyword I want to search for which is going to be clown. So this URL will return an image with these dimensions with this kind of subject. And so what am I doing? Basically, it's as if I'm copying this URL and I'm just kind of pasting it here into this attribute on the element. But I'm doing it with JavaScript, obviously. So what happens on the page? I get access to the clown and I change its source to this new URL. And if I go and look at it, hey presto, it's someone standing on an elephant, which is kind of a clown thing, I guess. That's pretty clowny. One of the interesting things about Lorem Flickr is each time you access it, you get a different image. So if I reload the page, it goes away and it's, goodness gracious me, I kind of wish that we weren't seeing that. That's quite scary. Looks like a rodeo entertainment thing, nothing to be alarmed by. There's like a clown with a mallet and there's a guy lying on the ground. We won't think about it too hard. You can see that it's a different image, right? So each time it accesses that HTTP address, it's pasting in a new image. So the key thing here is get access to the element. That's something that we always do with the DOM. And then we're using set attribute to set the specific source attribute to a specific URL. There is the mirroring idea of get attribute. So instead of set attribute, you can use get attribute. And you can use that to check what something is already set to and to react to that as well. So important to know that get attribute is available too. So now we have got quite a few abilities, right? We can get access to any element on the page by ID, and we can change its CSS, and we can change the attributes that it has, and we can change the text inside it or the HTML inside it. So we can basically reshape the entire web page with these powers. So what else might we want to be able to do? Well, there's a couple more things. One thing that we might want to be able to do is just have different ways of getting access to elements. Currently, if we always use getElement by ID, then we have to make sure that literally everything has an ID, right? So with getElement by ID, we can't access, for example, this header, because it doesn't have an ID. I could add one, but it would make sense if there were other ways of getting access to elements on a web page. And there are. What a shock. So let's look at the other key ways of accessing elements on a web page. And maybe the most obvious one to begin with is class, right? So we've been getting access to things with ID. Let's get access to things by their class name. So if, for example, let's go back to the HTML here, I can see that both of my H2s and my H1 all have a class of header, right? Each one of those has a class of header. So if I wanted to affect all of the H tags, one way that I could do that is I could try and get hold of everything that has a class of header. So how would I do that? There is a method called getElements by class name. What a shock. So document.getElements. Now it's plural, right? Because once you start talking about a class, you might have more than one. So getElements by class name. And it works in the same way. We have to specify what the class name is, which was header in this instance. Now, the important thing about this, right, and it's evident because we write the word elements with an S, it could return more than one thing. We don't know that there's only one. There might be more than one. There might be none. And so what this returns is basically an array. So let's call this headers. We're going to put it into a variable called headers. Now what's going to go into headers is something like an array. It's going to have a length property that we can check how many things there are. If it has a length of 0, then there are none. This one will have a length of 3, right? Because we know that there are 3 headers. And we can access individual elements in this array using the standard array approach. So for example, if I wanted to change the color of all of the headers, I would have to get them all by class name like this. And then how do I go through an array? I use a for loop, right? So I have to say for let I is assigned 0. Begin at the beginning, why not? I is less than what? Headers.length, because we know that it has a length property that tells us how long it is, how many of these elements there are. I++ to keep going through one by one. And then I can access each individual header inside that array. So the fastest way to do this is to say headers, give me the one at position I, so the first time through 0, then 1, then 2, because there are 3 total, .style, .color, or let me do it the other way. Style, color, in square brackets, is assigned, and let's make it something obvious like red. So we get all of the elements that have the class name of header, we store them in our headers array, effectively. we go through that array, and for each one in there, we set its color property of the style to red. Let's just make sure that that works before we get too excited. There we go. So each of the things that had a class of header it's had its style changed to red. So we can affect a group of different things by looping through their class name in this particular instance, right? So that's really useful. Just a quick note. It's not super important. Don't worry about it too much. But the thing that ends up in headers when we use Getelements by class name is not really an array. It's actually a thing called an HTML collection. We can treat it like an array, so it's not a big deal. Like, as you can see, it has a length property, and we can access its individual elements using the square brackets notation. So it's not a big deal. It doesn't have some of the standard array methods that you might use on a standard array. So just be aware if you end up trying to do something fancy with it, that it's not really an array. It's a thing called an HTML collection. But for loops like this, it works just the same, so we won't worry about it. So we can affect all of the things with a specific class name. What else might we want to do? Well, maybe we want to go through and get all of the tags. That would be the next thing we might do, right? So what if we wanted to affect only the h2 elements here? So I only want this one and this one. Well, they both have the class header, so I could target that, but the h1 tag has a class of header too, so the header class is not accurate. The best way to select both of these h2 elements is by their tag name, by h2. And there is a method called Getelements by tag name that will let us do that as well. So it works the same way, right? So we're going to assign into a variable. Let's call it h2s. It's going to be assigned document.getElements, again, plural, by tag name. And then you just name the tag in a string, right? So I want everything that has a tag of h2. And I'm going to store it in this h2s array. And again, I can loop through those. So for let I is assigned 0, I is less than h2s.length, I++. What do I want to do? Again, let's just do something simple and change their color, right? So h2s at position I want to change its style property, the color of that style to red, which I will do in hexadecimal again. So again, we're going through all of the h2 elements in this array that we got using Getelements by tag name, and we're changing the color property of the style to red. And again, there you go. So this time it's only the two h2 elements, right? It's not the h1 tag because we didn't use the class that time. So again, these are just different ways of selecting stuff, right? The key is to sort of just use the thing that makes the most sense to you. The final, most important, maybe, or just like takes care of everything in one go option here is one more thing, which is that we can select elements on the page just literally by using a CSS selector. So again, if we had that header example again, so if I want to get all of the things that have a class of header, I know that I can use document.getElements by class name, right? But if I wanted to write that in CSS notation, there's another method I can use, which is called query selector all. And what that lets us do is it lets us just literally write a CSS selector. For example, .header is the CSS selector for the header class, right? That will find everything with the header class, and again, same thing, pops it in here into this array-like thing, which I can then loop through in the usual way. Headers.length, I++, you know where this is going, right? Headers I.style, color is assigned red. Except it needs to be in a string, because otherwise nothing works. And this will do the same thing. So it's not a very revolutionary because it's the same thing, right? It's selecting the header class and making all of them red. The nice thing about this, I think, is it's a one-stop shop, right? We know that CSS can select all kinds of things in this way. So for example, I could select all of the h1 tags in the same way. So this is a valid CSS selector because it selects the h1 tags on the page. And voila, this one is now only selecting the h1 tag. You do the same thing for the h2 tag, just by changing it to h2. Now it's impacting the h2 tags. And so on and so forth. I could even do things like h1, h2 to select that group Now it affects the H1 and the H2. There's a sort of niceness to just always using this query selector all method, just because it lets us think in CSS, and in a lot of ways CSS is so nicely designed to access the contents of a web page already. That's literally what it's for. There's an argument to be made that this is a really nice way to use selection in our JavaScript as well. So query selector all, and then you can just write in any CSS selector that you choose, including things like with IDs, with a hash, for example, main heading, just selects the main heading, and so forth. That's a one-stop shop, if you like. Up to you if you want to use that or if you want to use the more specific methods. Okay, so we've just about seen all of the kinds of things that we want to maybe be able to do, but one more thing, just in terms of the very primitive manipulations of a web page, one more thing that we might want to do is, instead of just changing things on the web page, maybe we want to add things to the web page so that the web page can have new things added to it. So how do we do that? Well, again, there's methods for doing this, and there are two key methods if we want to add something to the web page. The first thing is, how do we create a new element inside JavaScript? This is mercifully, again, relatively simple. So if I want to create a new element, I use document.createElement. That's the name of the method, createElement. And inside here, I list the kind of element that it's going to be, which is the tag name. So if I want to create a new paragraph, for example, that's a P tag. So I write P in here to create a P element, which I know is a paragraph. You're probably guessing this already, but if I say document.createElement P to create a paragraph element, that's going to be returned from this method. So I need to store it somewhere, right? So I'm going to call it a new P. So my new paragraph element is going to be created here and then stored in this new P element. And that's great. However, currently all this is just an empty P tag, right? So not a very interesting thing to add to anybody's website. I mean, you can. Maybe it's very meta and you've got all these empty paragraphs and it's about how hard it is to write a novel or something. Up to you. However, maybe we want to actually do something with it. So let's just at least put some text inside it. How do we put text inside an element on a web page? Do you remember? I do. It's the inner text property. So I can say new p.innerText. And I can say, gosh, I sure do like clowns. I sort of instinctively did that in double quotes, but I want to be using template strings as much as possible because they will let me substitute in variables if I ever come to it. So I set the inner text of this paragraph, and now it's as if I've got a p tag with this text inside of it. That's great, but if we go back and look at the web page, it's not there, right? Like it didn't come into existence on the web page. And the reason for that is that this element still only just exists inside my program. I haven't added it onto the page. So how do I add it onto the page? Well, I need to choose where I want to add it. So because HTML is hierarchical, we need to be able to get the sort of the piece of the page that we want to add this new paragraph to, and then add it there. So where do I want to add this new paragraph about clowns? Well, I think it makes sense to add it to the clown section. I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't know about you. I think so. So I need to get a reference then to the clown section. How am I going to do that? Well, it looks like the easiest way is going to be to grab it by its ID. So I need to get hold of the thing that I want to add my paragraph to. So let's say clown section is assigned document.getElement by ID clown section. That will give me the clown section, and then how do I actually add my new paragraph into that clown section? We do it by talking about the parent. The clown section is going to be the parent of this new tag. So we say clown section, since it's in charge of adding things to itself. And then the other method that we need is append child, A-P-P-E-N-D child, append child. What is the child that I want to append? It's the element inside my new p variable. So let's make sure that this works before we get too excited. There it is there, right? So here's my clown section here with the heading, a clown, a picture of a clown, and now we've added in a paragraph that says, gosh, I sure do like clowns. Okay, so how did we do that? We created a p element. We added some text to the p element using the inner text property. Then we got hold of the clown section, which was the place we wanted to add our new paragraph, and we used append child to add that paragraph into that section. So it's a few steps, right? But it's, again, super powerful. We created a brand new HTML element and we added it to a specific location in our web page. And one thing that you're probably noticing here is that my new paragraph is at the end of that section. Now, that's the default behavior, right? Append child means add it to the end of this particular parent of the clown section. There are ways to add things in specific other locations inside of a section, and there are more complicated ways of doing that. But of course, it is possible. You can add something to the front of a section, you can add something halfway through a section. It's all just about how you express that. But the simplest idea is always to add something to the end with append child. Okay, so then we have the superpower to create brand new elements and add them to the page. What is the other thing that we sort of most obviously might want to do? We might want to remove elements as well, right? So how do I remove something entirely from the page? Well, first of all, I need to get a reference to it. So let's get a reference to the main heading. We can do that with getElement by ID, or I can do getElement. Let's just do getElement by ID. It's nice and simple. We know that its ID is main heading. How do I take it out of the page? There is a method called remove child, which you give to the main heading. Now, how do I remove it? This is not going to work on its own, right? So if I look at, especially not if I have a typo, if I write main heading, it's still there. That didn't work. Why didn't it work? Well, because this is called remove child. So this is a method that needs to be called on the parent of main heading in order to successfully remove it. That's starting to sound kind of painful because you've got to like also now I have to work out which element is the parent of the main heading and like kind of go and look in here, and I guess it's the body, so I know that that's the parent. But that's kind of stupid, and it's going to get like irritating if I want to do these things dynamically. So very fortunately for us, there is an easy way to get the parent of any element on a page, which is that we write the element that we want the parent of, which is main heading, and then we just say dot parent element. That will give me access to whatever the parent is of the element that I'm talking about. So main heading.parent element will give me the body in this instance, and then I can call remove child on that element. So main heading.parent element.remove child main heading feels a little bit sort of circular, but this way we can easily always get hold of the parent and then use the parent to remove the child. This way we can target the child specifically and then only talk about the child in order to remove it. The result of that is the main heading is now gone. It was deleted within JavaScript, and therefore we have the power to delete things from a document as well as to add them and change their CSS and change their attributes, and generally speaking just have total power over the web page that our script is running on. So we've got a huge amount of power. We're scratching the surface here, of course. There's a lot more that we can do, and there's more to be said that we will say in future videos. But these basic ideas of changing CSS, of changing attributes, of changing text and changing HTML and creating elements and adding them to the page, and also of deleting elements, these give us the very fundamental superpowers to do pretty much anything that we want to do to a web page. Via what? Via the document object model. So now you know what it is, you know the basics. It's time to keep going and to learn how to do even more with this document object model of ours. See you in the next video.